Hello and welcome back to Christie's Cozy Corner. And this video is going to be my January wrap-up. Now, this is the part where I tell you that January passed by so fast and I can't believe 1 month in 2024 has already gone by, and I have 6 things to talk about today, 5 of which I've read and 1 that I DNF'd. So let's just get right into it, starting with the DNF. And that one was unfortunately Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. So this is a young adult historical fantasy romance that I was really looking forward to because it was one of the most popular books of 2023. I think it won the YA fantasy sci-fi category in the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2023, and it was also on a lot of people's best books of the year, a lot of people who have pretty similar tastes to me. So I was like, okay, you know what? Like, this book sounds like exactly my kind of thing, especially when you also tell me it's about these 2 rivals who work at a newspaper and they're competing with each other for the columnist position, and there's also like a war going on and they're exchanging letters to each other, not knowing who the other is because of like magical things that happen in this world. I was like, everything on paper makes this book sound perfect for me. So naturally, I was really excited to pick this book up. And unfortunately, it just didn't start off very strong to begin with for me. For me, I think it's really mostly the writing style that I wasn't really like my kind of thing. And I kept going hoping that it would get better, but I eventually stopped around the 42% mark because at that point, I just find myself like not really caring about the story or the characters. Like, I wasn't invested in either of the characters. And if I'm not invested in the characters in a romance book, then of course I'm not really going to be invested in their romance either. So, you know, kind of defeats the whole point of reading a romance. So what really didn't work for me in terms of the writing is I feel like it just has like a certain tone and quality to it that I didn't really vibe with. And I'm not saying that this is the case, but it's just like how it read to me, which is that there are certain kind of phrases and the tone that the writing uses that makes it feel like it's trying like a little bit too hard to sound deep and poignant and trying to like draw emotions from you. That it really stood out to me that it felt like this is what the writing was trying to do. So because I noticed that, it kind of backfired and really took me out of the story, and it just made me feel like, you know, this doesn't sound as good as you think it sounds. So I really just couldn't get past that aspect of this book, and it just really prevented me from being able to enjoy anything else about it. I will admit I did read ahead a little bit, or rather I read like a summary of what happens like towards the end, and again, like the summary makes it sound so good because there are things that happen, especially in the relationship between these 2 characters, that I'm just like, I love that. Like, I love that idea and the concept. So then I tried reading a little bit more, and again, I just couldn't get past the writing. I was just like, okay, you know what, this really isn't working for me, so I think it's best that I just DNF here. And I was talking to Elliot Brooks about this book because she was like, hey, I noticed you DNF'd it. I was just wondering like when you DNF'd it, like at what point in the book you DNF'd it and why. So I was explaining all that, and she mentioned that the second half of this book is when it starts to get like really good, and it feels like almost a completely different story from the first half. So again, like, that just makes me intrigued again because I'm very easily convinced when it comes to this kind of thing. So I'm like, you know what, maybe like this just ends up being like a soft DNF. Like, maybe later I want to try picking this up again and trying it again eventually. But I think for now, I do want to put this book down and just like distance myself from it temporarily, because I feel like if I continue now, I would still just be like really annoyed with the writing. So I want to put a little space between me and this book. So then later, after like I kind of forget some of the things about this book, maybe I can try it again and see if I end up liking the second half better than the first, and maybe end up liking it in the end. But for now, this book was a DNF. And then for the rest of the books that I actually finished in January, I will just talk about them in the order that I read them. And the first book that I finished in January, also the first book that I finished in the whole year, is Cage of Dreams by Rebecca Schaeffer, and this is the second book in the City of Nightmares duology. So I read City of Nightmares as my last book of 2023, and I really enjoyed that one and gave it a 4.5 stars. And I was like, you know what? I kind of just want to continue with the series because it is just a duology, so I might as well read the second book now since it's out anyway, and that way I don't have just like another book on my perpetually currently reading series. So this series is kind of set in like a version of our world where people can turn into the things that they are most afraid of if they have a nightmare about it. And that is what happened to the sister of our main character when she was younger. Her sister turned into a giant spider and killed her family, and now the main character, whose name is Ness, is deathly afraid of all nightmares in general. And if that concept sounds really wacky, it definitely sets the tone for the whole series, because this series is kind of just like really ridiculous. Like the ideas and some of the things that happen, and especially like the kind of nightmares that arise. Some of these are just like really wild and bonkers, but that's also what made it extremely entertaining, especially because our main character also works for a cult that is totally not a cult, but it actually is a cult. And I just had a lot of fun with this whole series, and it's also set in the city called Newham, which is kind of like Gotham's quirky younger cousin. Like everyone in the city is evil and everyone in power is corrupt, and it's really terrible for the people living in there, but at the same time it's also kind of really ridiculous and entertaining as a reader to read like all the things that happen in this city. Like for example, there's the mayoral election that's going on, and everyone knows that when it's the elections, there's going to be a lot of assassinations that happen where candidates like try to kill each other off. So everyone knows like, you know, during this time it's best to like stay off the streets because anything can happen. Like anyone can just die at any time, and because it's like a really lawless city, like everyone kind of just like gets away with it. So, you know, that's like the kind of vibe that you can expect from this book. And like I said, I really enjoyed the first book, and I gave that one a 4.5 stars. The second one, I only gave 4 stars, which is still a really good rating. The main reason I gave it a slightly lower rating than the first one is because I did feel like in this second book, some of the writing tended to get a little bit repetitive, and I was just kind of like noticing it a lot because there was just like a lot of introspection from the main character's perspective about how she's afraid of these nightmares, but she has to get over these fears. And it was just like a lot of back and forth about that, and it just kept coming up so much, and like the same ideas just kept being brought up so often. And like I can understand why, because you know, this isn't something that someone can just get over right away. It takes like some time to process through that, and sometimes you go back and forth because you think you're over it, but it turns out you're not. And like the whole healing process, especially dealing with the main character's PTSD, it's understandable that it takes some time and it takes some repetition to get through. However, as a reading experience, it was just kind of getting like a little bit tedious, and once you notice like that kind of repetition, it's kind of hard not to notice it. So it was kind of like affecting my reading experience of it a little bit. There were also other parts where I just had to really suspend my disbelief when it came to the main character's plot armor, because like I said, like people in the city die like left and right. There is no order to this chaos at all, but somehow the main character just like by sheer luck tends to be able to escape all of it and survive unscathed, at least physically. So that was a little bit of like kind of, okay, you kind of just like accept it and move on. And I guess in a way, the series also like really pokes fun at itself in that way, because a lot of the writing is also kind of like really meta, where it's like it's self-aware in a way. But the main thing that I really liked about this series and made it so fun to read was Ness herself. She is definitely not your typical main character in that she is fully aware that she is a coward and she's useless and dumb, and she's not afraid to admit it. But despite all that, she still manages to overcome the odds because she knows that she is not strong. So she has to use the other means at her disposal to try to get through everything. And even though this series is very silly at times, it also touches on some more serious topics like PTSD and dealing with grief and healing, and other kind of messages like learning how to trust and lean on others, and how our experiences and the things we go through can change our perception of the world. So overall, I still had a really good time with this series, and in the end, I was like, I kind of want more in this world, because it ended in a way that wrapped up this story very nicely, but kind of like hinted in something else more to come. So if the author ends up writing more books in this world, I am totally down to read them, because I feel like the way she made this world, there is just like so much potential for even more creativity within it that I'm really excited to see like what else she can do with it. And also, if I haven't mentioned already, I buddy read this book as well as the first book in this duology with my friend Maggie from Dog-Eared Pages, who I will link down below. And the next book that I read in January was The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty, the third and final book to the Daevabad trilogy, which I am so happy that I have finally completed. I started reading this series quite a few years ago. I think like the first time I read City of Brass was in 2018 or 2019. It was like pretty soon after when the book released. And I actually didn't really love City of Brass the first time I read it, but then a few years later, I read it again in 2022. And that time I ended up loving it for reasons why, like, I don't even know why my feelings about this book were so different from the first time I read it and the second time. And so I finally continued with the series, and I read Kingdom of Copper mid last year, and now I finally finished this last book in the beginning of 2024. And usually last books in series don't work the best for me. I just don't really have the best track record when it comes to it. But this series definitely stuck the landing, and I absolutely loved this last book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was so close to being perfect. So this series is a Middle Eastern inspired fantasy that is originally set in Cairo, Egypt, and follows our main character Nahri, who is a thief. And she does like all these kind of scams to get by in her life, but one day during one of these scams, she accidentally summons up a jinn, and this jinn realizes that Nahri is actually part jinn herself, and so she is whisked away to the city of Daevabad where all the other jinn live. And in that city, there's like multiple divisions of tribes, and what I love about the series is like all the internal politics that goes on between these tribes, and it gets really, really complicated because there's so many things that happened like so long ago, and like betrayals between one tribe and another, and they kind of have to try to like make peace right now, but no one ever really forgets like the things that were done in the past. So there's a lot of like, you wronged us this time, so we took revenge on you, and there's like a lot of back and forth. So it's kind of like, you know, who started it, right? Like, who is in the right? Everyone has wronged each other at one point or another, and like peace is like just so hard to achieve. And then with Nahri being brought back into this world and her introduction into it, her existence just throws everything else into turmoil as well. And so it's just really interesting to see like the role that Nahri played in this world and everything that happens as a result of that. And another thing that is probably my favorite thing about this series is the romantic subplots, the tension between these characters. Oh god, it's so good and it's so delicious, and it's like exactly the kind of romantic subplot that I thrive on, because the main focus is still on like the plot and the world and the politics, but then you have this added like underlayer of tension between the characters and like their romantic entanglements, and it just makes everything so much better, especially when you don't know like who is going to end up together in the end. There's like a lot of will they, won't theys, and it just adds like a whole other element of like my investment in the story, you know? It's like my favorite thing when it comes to series like this. So like I mentioned, like this book was very, very so close to being perfect. I think the only thing that kind of like docked marks, in my opinion, is this one particular storyline that happened in this book that I wasn't really the biggest fan of, and I kind of just didn't really like by how it played into everything else, and there was like a pretty strong focus on that in this book. So because that was in there, it just kind of like hindered my enjoyment of this book like just a little bit, because I was kind of just like, what are we doing here? Like, what is happening? But overall, I loved how it ended. I think it was like quite literally the perfect ending for this series. And if you know me and my reading taste, you know the kind of endings that I love. So I'll just leave it at that. I will say though, part of the ending is kind of like very typical of what you would expect in this kind of fantasy. So it's kind of just like a little bit predictable and safe in that regard. But at the same time, I'm like, you know, I kind of understand like this is the way it had to end, you know? So I gave this book 4.5 stars, and I would actually give the entire series overall 4.5 stars as well. And I just highly recommend it. I love it so much. And the next book I finished was one of my most anticipated releases of 2024, and that was Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. And as you can see, I have nothing to hold up for this book because even though I pre-ordered it and it is now February, I still do not have my hands on the physical copy of this book, which I really shouldn't complain because I ordered it from the UK retailer, so it makes sense that it's taking a while for it to get to me, and it's really like first world problems, but at the same time, I'm like, I want the physical book already! Anyway, so I buddy read this book with Elliot Brooks, and by that I mean Elle finished it the very same day that it came out, and I read it a little bit more slowly over the next few days. But that ended up working out perfectly fine for me because that meant that whenever I had some thoughts or some reactions that I wanted to share, I could just like share them right away and not having to worry about like, oh, maybe Elle hasn't gotten to this part yet and I don't want to like spoil it in case she hasn't. But since she had already finished it, I could be as free and candid with my thoughts as possible, which of course, a lot of them were just screaming about Bamblebee. And this series obviously follows the main character Emily, who is a professor of dryadology, which means that she studies fae. And in the first book, she is putting together an encyclopedia of fairies. And these are like the very kind of traditional kind of fae that you see in folklore and mythology, which is like my favorite kind of fae. Like the kind of fae that are very trickster and conniving, and you have to like be very careful with how you word things and how you interact with them. And some of them are also very vain, so you have to like know the kind of fae that you are dealing with in order to survive your encounter with them. And in the second book, now that she has completed her encyclopedia, she is putting together like a map of the fairylands. And I really enjoyed this book and gave it 4 stars. I just really like Emily as a main character, and this entire series is told in a series of journal entries from her perspective. And she just has this like dry wit and sense of humor that is like not so obvious, but you know, she has like a few like snarky comments here and there that are just so fun to read. And then of course we also have Bamblebee, her colleague and fellow professor in dryadology, and who is also the love interest. And Bamblebee just makes everything like 10 times better, just like being there in general. And he is definitely present again in this book, and just so many more interactions between him and Emily that just made this book such a delight. And in this book, we also get introduced to some other characters who follow along with Emily on whatever journey that she is in this book as well, including her niece, who is now also studying dryadology, and also the head of the dryadology department, Professor Rose. And these characters just round out the overall cast very nicely. And I gave the first book 5 stars and this book 4 stars. And not because I think this book was like worse in any way. In fact, I feel like both of them are quite similar. Like they kind of have a similar vibe and kind of have like a similar like story progression. But I think I was just like really charmed by the first book when I first read it. Like it was just something like kind of new and refreshing for me, and I was just like really obsessed with it. But because I got that like new kind of feeling from the first book, I didn't really get that again in the second book. So I think that just kind of like brought my enamorment of it down like just a little bit. And also what I really loved in the first book was like Emily's relationship and interactions with the villagers in the town that she was visiting, whereas that was kind of like absent in the second book. Even though she is visiting like a new area again, the townspeople didn't really play like as prominent of a role as they did in the first one. And I just feel like in the first book it added like this kind of found family-ness element to the story that was absent in the second book. But again, I still really enjoyed this book overall, and I'm definitely going to continue reading this series. I just can't get enough of Emily and Bamblebee, and I can't wait to see what they do next. And also another thing that I'll mention about this series that I really enjoy is that I love how this is told in journal entries from Emily's perspective, and she has footnotes in her own journal entries, which is like just so typical Emily, and I love it. And then the next book that I read and finished was Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this is the second book in the Founders trilogy following Foundryside. And this one was a reread because I had initially read it so long ago and I wanted to continue with the last book in this series. And so to refresh my memory and so I can go into the third book with all of the events and scenes and world as fresh in my mind as possible, I decided to reread this one, and it is such a good thing that I did because while I was reading it, I realized like I remember none of this happening. And so I had a really good time with it, just like I did the first time around. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. And I've heard a lot of people say that they liked Foundryside a lot, but then they weren't as impressed with Shorefall. And I would say that I am quite the opposite, where I still really enjoyed Foundryside, but I loved Shorefall even more. And for me, I think it's mainly because of the cast of characters. They're just like so much closer now, and there's so many more interactions interactions between them that I just loved reading all of that. And this series is mainly set in the city called Tavan that is ruled by these 4 main merchant houses, and the areas that each merchant house resides over has like their own rules and governing bodies. And the main character, Sanchia, lives in the area that is not ruled by any merchant houses, also known as the Commons. And this area is kind of like no man's land where there are no laws and pretty much anything anyone says goes. And so she gets by in life as a thief. And the first book starts off with Sanchia being hired to steal something from one of the merchant houses. And when she does, she realizes just how dangerous this thing that she has stolen is. And she has no doubt that once this job is done, whoever hired her is definitely going to get rid of her to hide any evidence of it. And she also realizes that this thing that she has been hired to steal is way more dangerous than anyone has any business owning. And so the series kicks off from there with Sanchia basically running for her life and trying to figure out what to do. And now the second book, Shorefall, takes place about 3 or 4 years after the events of Foundry Side, the first book. And if you've heard about the series, then you've probably also heard people talk about the magic system, which is called scriving. And what scriving is basically is it consists of different kind of symbols that are called sigils, and each sigil has its own meaning. And you can use these sigils to basically change like how an object functions and how an object like thinks of itself. So some of the examples that you see scriving being used in this world is like a carriage that moves on its own, because the wheels have been scribed to believe that they are constantly traveling downhill. So they believe that they're rolling downhill, and so the wheels will move on its own and push the carriage forward. And you can also use these sigils to like change the reality of an object. Like another example, for example, you have something that's made of wood, but you want it to be extra durable. You can use the sigil for stone and write that on the object to make it believe that it's made of stone. And there's just so many cool and creative applications to this magic system, because it's not just like you use one sigil and that's it. You can use like a combination or like a string of sigils to really change how things function. And it's just really cool, like the way that it's done in this world. And a lot of people also compare this magic system to like a magical version of coding, which I can definitely see. And I remember also another article that I read that called Foundry Side like a fantasy cyberpunk or something like that, which after I saw that, I was like, that is actually like a really fitting way to describe the series. So I love the second book because we see even more applications of this magic system, and we also still have like these kinds of heists that were very present in the first book as well. And I obviously love heists, so I was really into the storyline and everything that happened. And that is quite ironic because right after I finished Shorefall, I read Locklands, the third and final book to this trilogy, and I actually gave this book 3 stars, which really surprised me, and honestly, I was really disappointed because I honestly thought that this series could be one of my new favorite series, but unfortunately, I just didn't love this third and final book, and I'll explain why. So this third book now takes place 8 years after the events of Shorefall, which is quite a big time gap, and a lot of things happened in between, and the setting is now completely different in this third book. We still have some of the same characters, but there's also like a bunch of new characters, and the magic has just been expanded and developed in such a way that it's so different from the first 2 books now, which was much to my disappointment, because part of the reason why I love the first 2 books so much was because of this magic system. And I feel like in the first 2 books especially, because the magic system was still in a way that made sense, like you could follow along with it and kind of like understand the logic. But now in the third one, it's just been expanded so much that it's kind of like hard to conceptualize at this point, and you kind of just have to like go along with it and just accept that things are the way they are, and they can kind of like just do all these like wacky things with the magic now. And I say it's ironic because I said that I loved the action in a Shorefall, but then in Locklands, I feel like it was mostly the action scenes that I did not love, because it was just like so much non-stop action, scene after scene after scene, and it just like never ended. And I was like getting so exhausted to the point where I was like, I need to take a break. Like, you need to give me some kind of breather, because it literally felt like, honestly, like the first almost like a little bit more than half of this book was just like one non-stop action sequence. But then the thing is, there was also still like some parts of those action scenes that I still enjoyed, because it was like reminiscent of like the heistiness of the first 2 books. But at the same time, it's also being coupled with like how the magic system was being used in this new way. And I just couldn't really connect to it as much as I could in the first two books. So I wasn't as excited reading this book anymore, and at some point I was just like kind of waiting for things to end. I was like so done with this. But then when I got to the ending was so good. Like, I loved how they ended everything and the conclusion, and there were so many things that were like wrapped up in like not a neat little bow kind of way, but like in a way that like called back to things from the first book. And I'm like, that's just like one of my favorite kind of ways to end things. And obviously the ending made me cry. So I am so mad at this book because it could have been so good for me, but there are other parts that I didn't like. I just really didn't like. And before I forget, I should mention one of those things that I also didn't really like about this book was I just felt like a lot of character dialogue got so repetitive. And I feel like I saw hints of that in Shorefall. I don't quite remember Foundry Side because I reread that one like quite some time ago, so it's not as fresh in my mind. But when I was reading Shorefall, I saw hints of this, but I feel like because I enjoyed like so much of the other stuff in Shorefall, it didn't bother me as much. But it was really obvious to me in this one because I wasn't enjoying it as much, so like these things like really stood out for me. So it was like so many times the characters would say things like, oh shit, or shit, or oh god, or oh my god, or oh no, like that kind of dialogue. And it would just be so often. Like, I borrowed the ebook for this and I search up the word shit and it appears 193 times in this book, which I feel like is way too much. And so every time a character said something like, oh god, or oh shit, it was just like so obvious. And like I mentioned before with Cage of Dreams and some of the repetitive stuff in that book, every time it happened, it just took me out of the story because I'm just like, that's all I noticed, and it's like in my head. So that was also like a major reason why I didn't enjoy this book as much. And I'm just really mad at it because the things that it did well, it did so good, and literally the ending was perfect. So I'm like, I almost want to rewrite this book and just take out all those things that annoyed me, and then I would have loved this book. So unfortunately, this series didn't end on the greatest note for me, and I'm so disappointed because I really wanted this series to be one of my new favorite series. But because of this last book, I just don't think I can say that, despite how much I still really love Foundry Side and Shorefall. And also, I just still really love like all the themes and ideas that this series explores, like about history constantly repeating itself and humanity always making the same mistakes, and like the dangers of knowledge and invention and power. Like, all those things are so interesting, and I do think this series explores those things quite well. And especially like the way the direction some of the magic system went in, like, even though I didn't love it because it was so different from the first two books, I do think that the direction that it went in was really fascinating. It became like a little bit more of a softer magic system as opposed to previously before when it seemed like a really like defined hard magic system. This book still feels like even more sci-fi-ish than before, like the way that certain things in their society are like now and the way that they function. And I do love the idea and what they did with it, and like really makes you think how our society would be like if it could be like what they did in here. And it's really interesting to think about, but also at the same time kind of terrifying. I thought that was so cool. So yeah, that was Locklands by Robert Jackson Bennett, which was my first big disappointment of 2024, especially because I was so looking forward to this conclusion. It was one of my most anticipated conclusions, and I put it off for so long, and now when I finally picked it up, I was like, I'm ready to finish this and love this whole series. And then this. But alas, that is the way that things played out, and what can you do about it? Hopefully I won't have too many more disappointments for 2024, especially because I'm hoping to close out a lot more series this year, so I'm hoping that they will stick the landing. Much like The Empire of Gold, that one was so good, and I just want like every conclusion to give me the same feelings that that one did. So that's it for my January wrap up. Let me know in the comments if you read any of these books and what you thought of them. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next one. Bye!